And what's your reaction to the NSS in Europe, and is there any impact here, especially with regard to a nuclear action?
Well, when we let's just focus on the nuclear for a second. Um, NATO has three nuclear armed members: the United States of America, France, and Great Britain. All three ostensibly maintain independent nuclear deterrence capabilities outside of the framework of NATO. NATO has a nuclear weapons, a nuclear deterrent capacity that's built around, uh, around 100, maybe less, B-61 gravity bombs that the United States government has control of, but we have deployed them in specific nations that have assumed a nuclear posture, meaning, for instance, Germany has trained pilots and aircraft that are designated to use the B-61 bomb in combat. Turkey has done the same thing. The Netherlands, Italy, there's another one out there, but
Belgium.
Belgium. So they all have nuclear capable aircraft with pilots that have been trained on how to deploy or use nuclear weapons. And in a time of war, we would load nuclear weapons up on their aircraft, and they would use them. So now, when we look at this, understand that NATO cannot use nuclear weapons without the United States agreeing to it. So I'm not worried about NATO going rogue because NATO doesn't have any nuclear weapons they can go rogue with. France and England have recently come, I think there was the Northwood Summit or something of that nature, where they came together and they have done a unified nuclear posture where they say, because the United States is backing away from our commitment to Europe, they've said we need to step in and fill the gap. And so they now are offering to extend their independent strategic deterrence outside of a NATO framework, to extend it to Poland and Germany. This is a very dangerous undertaking, because it does fall outside of the framework of NATO, which means the United States has very limited capacity to interfere on that. On the national security strategy, look, there's two schools of thought. One is that the best way for us to control NATO is to stay in NATO and maintain a leadership position in NATO. And therefore, NATO will do the bidding of the United States. The problem is that we've spent the last 2 decades configuring NATO to view Russia as the enemy, and to view Ukraine as a mechanism to help destabilize Russia and achieve the strategic defeat of Russia. Now that the United States under Trump has decided that that's not the policy direction we want to go, we are in direct contravention to everything that we have been positioning Europe and NATO to do for the last several decades. And Europe and NATO are not ready to shift because their political and economic elites have basically built their political power base on this anti-Russian framework that's been put in. So what the Trump administration, I believe, has done with the National Security Strategy document is to redefine Russia as not an adversary, but as a strategic partner of stability. It's an amazing document from that standpoint, because nowhere in this document do they treat Russia as the enemy or as the adversary. Russia is treated as a partner of strategic stability. That normally was language reserved for our European allies and our NATO partners. But now Europe is actually postured as the threat, that Europe is headed in the wrong trajectory, and that we need to get Europe to change its point. This is the kind of language you used to use with Russia. Russia's headed in the wrong direction towards autocracy. We need to get Russia to move towards democracy. We're now saying that Europe is heading in a way that's opposite of our definition of democracy, and that Europe has to change its way. We also speak ill of NATO. It's curious, the language they said. They said that in the coming years, the demographics of Europe will shift such that nations that are currently NATO nations would not have qualified to be NATO nations when the charter was originally signed, which brings into question the validity from the American standpoint, the Trump administration standpoint, of the entire charter. So we are looking at revolutionary change coming out of this document, at least for the next year. Midterm elections are coming up, and there's a big push in Europe right now to prevent any radical change in the posture of supporting Ukraine, to have this war drag on until at least the midterm elections, and pray from the European standpoint for political change in the United States, for the Democrats to get control of Congress, and therefore to paralyze the Trump administration for the last 2 years and create the conditions for a Democratic president who can return the United States to what we were under Biden administration. This is a document that is either, from your standpoint, either reflective of reality, a very pragmatic document, or it's an inherently destabilizing document that seeks to undo decades of relationship with Europe, or a mixture of the two.
Thanks. Well, just a quick follow-up from your standpoint, and well, my standpoint is I think NATO should go by the way of history. It should have been ended as soon as the Warsaw Pact ended. And so what is the usefulness now? It seems like just a troublemaker.
Yeah. First of all, I personally agree with you. I think NATO lost its utility when the Cold War ended, and NATO has become a force of instability in order to justify its continued existence. For a while, they were just an extension of American hegemony and sustaining American hegemony, but they burned themselves out in Afghanistan. And now NATO is desperately looking for a new reason to exist, and they have manufactured the Russia is a threat narrative, and they've provoked a conflict in Ukraine that helps sustain that narrative. The good news is, I don't think NATO can survive. Even if, let's say, you and I were believing that we wanted NATO to survive, I think NATO is so fundamentally, terminally ill. They sat on the couch for too long. They're like a bodybuilder who used to go to the gym back in the 80s. I mean, anybody who was in the military in the 80s, you know what Reforger was. You know what we were doing. You know how good we were. And you know how hard we trained. We were the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the military. We were super bodybuilders. What's NATO done since then is just sit on the couch and eat donuts. And they are fat. They are out of shape. They can't lift weights. They can't do anything. The only
we need to send Pete Hegseth over there to shape him up.
Pete could go over there and teach him how to do push-ups and pull-ups. But the point is, it's not just that, but they've become so dependent on the United States on so many things. Logistically, we make NATO function logistically. Command and control, we are the communications backbone of that. Leadership, the bottom line is NATO can't do anything of substance and anything of sustainability without the American presence. And we are starting to back out of this kind of stuff, and NATO is being called upon to do it themselves. And they are in an absolute panic because they can't do it themselves. They lack the capacity. The French did a major logistics exercise 2 years ago. The maximum number of troops that France can actually throughput at any time is 12,500. Then their system falls apart. And they can't sustain that. That's just getting them from point A to point B, but there's no sustainability. There's no ability to continue to stream logistics in. And France is the best one. They're the one NATO country that can, deploy 12,500 troops, but that's it. And in a modern high intensity conflict, that's not enough. That's not nearly enough. And so, Germany has no capability whatsoever. They've deployed this brigade to Lithuania. 2 of the 3 battalions are German battalions. They're not fully equipped yet. They don't know if they can produce the equipment to equip them yet. The 3rd battalion is a combined NATO battalion. The total brigade has 14 nations involved. That's a command and control nightmare. And yet that's NATO in a heartbeat right now. So I'm not worried. I mean, I am concerned always when we're dealing with nuclear weapons about mistakes, misjudgments, miscalculations taking place. I'm very concerned about the comments that were made by General Chris Donahue earlier this year, where he talked about, we could take Kaliningrad out in a heartbeat. I don't know if people have been reading. There was a Chinese online portal that's linked to the Chinese Ministry of Defense that just published a paper, I think today, that talks about the concept. They use American wargaming models that have been published, nuclear wargaming models, and they postulate what would happen if Chris Donahue actually followed through on his plans to eradicate Kaliningrad. And they said that within 5 days, 34 to 60 million Europeans would be killed because Russia would retaliate overwhelmingly using nuclear weapons. And the thing is, I agree with them. I mean, I just interviewed a major voice in Russia's strategic planning, a guy named Sergei Karaganov. He made his name, he's very influential with Vladimir Putin. But 2 years ago, he published a paper that got a lot of play in Russia, where he said that Russia needs to do a preemptive nuclear attack on Poland to nip Poland in the bud. And he said that we don't worry about America because America is not willing to trade Boston for Poznan, meaning that Russia feels that it could hit Europe and the United States would not respond nuclear because the United States would, and this was during the Biden administration. Now, when Secretary Scott Bessent has told the Europeans that America under Trump, if Russia attacked Europe under Trump, that our Article 5 response would be to sell Europe more weapons, but we would not be sending troops to fight alongside the Europeans. So we are walking away. And if Europe now acts in a way that's counter to the strategic direction of the Trump administration, which is seeking to de-escalate in Ukraine, if Europe decides to escalate and provokes a Russian response, many Russians believe that the United States would stand by and do nothing if they struck Europe using overwhelming nuclear force. I'm not saying they're right. I don't support this. What I'm saying is this is the mentality that exists in many sectors of Russia today, and it's a very dangerous mentality. And this is why the European talk is so destabilizing. I personally believe that Europe can't back up its rhetoric. There's no way Europe's going to get 800,000 men. There's no way Europe's going to build the tanks. Germany is deindustrializing. Rheinmetall isn't making any money right now because the cost of steel is too expensive. They don't have the furnace. They have to buy the weapons grade steel from Sweden because Germany can no longer produce it because they can't afford the energy costs of keeping the furnaces up and running. So there's a lot of talk and no ability to back it up. But the problem is talk creates perceptions, and perceptions create their own reality. And all it takes is one act of stupidity, one act of misjudgment and miscalculation for mistakes to be made. And if, who knows, if Karaganov's right, there's an element within Russia that says, if you attack Kaliningrad, we don't wait for this to develop conventionally because Kaliningrad is isolated and maybe could be overwhelmed by NATO forces. So Russia would respond with overwhelming nuclear power. And Putin talked about this the other day. He said, if Europe wants to do this, understand, there will be no one to negotiate with. That's the president of Russia hinting that Europe would be destroyed. He said European civilization would be erased. This is where we're at right now, where a major nuclear power, in response to the posturing of NATO, is simply putting Europe on notice. We will erase you with nuclear weapons. So we get back to square one. This is why we need to have nuclear arms control, so we can stop this kind of stupidity.